Now, in our final lecture on micro supply factors, we'll look at the concepts of labour and capital efficiency and how they affect different supply curves in different markets. Now, why is efficiency such an important topic to understand when concerning micro supply and macro supply factors as a whole? Now, we must note that efficiency is synonymous with productivity. And so productivity is the output over the number of inputs made to a product. So this means a company is more efficient when the outputs are greater or increase compared to the number of inputs. Okay, so let's assume that labour and capital machinery exhibit diminishing marginal products. So let's look at the concept of diminishing marginal products. Diminishing marginal products. And this is in the micro scale. So we're not talking about the macro scale as of yet, but in the micro scale. So let's say in the market for chocolates. Now we know that obviously the market for chocolates, or the production process for chocolates, is often very complicated. So you have lots of activities behind the scenes. But let's assume that we just oversimplify this into a few different stages. So we have making the chocolates as our first stage. Then we have wrapping them, and then lastly we have casing, and then distributing. So we have three main steps on how the market of chocolate is produced. And now let's assume that we have one labour unit. So we have 1 unit of labour at the moment. What this means is that one person needs to make the chocolates, they need to wrap them up, and then they have to case them for distribution. This can often be very ineffective. And so let's increase this to 2 units. And we see that the productivity of the firm will increase because one person can make the chocolates and wrap half of them, while the other person wraps half of them, the other half, and then cases them for production. So in this case it's more effective, a little bit more effective than just having one person do the whole job. However, let's increase this to 3 units of labour. We can have one person making the chocolates, we can have one person wrapping up the chocolates, and we can have one person casing up the chocolates. And this is a very, very productive, or relatively more productive firm now. But let's say we have 10 people, or let's say for example, for the sake, let's just make the number more rounded. Let's say we have 21. And we know 21 is a factor of 3. So let's say 21 units. We have 7 people making the chocolates, 7 people wrapping them up, and 7 people casing. And this is a very productive process. Let's assume that if one person makes 10 chocolates per hour, and if one person cases or wraps them at 10 wraps per hour, and so on, we can make, as you can see, 70 chocolates. That's a little unclear, so hang on. 7 chocolates. An hour. Now let's assume that in the production line that they are very close together. So we have the 1 here, so we have making chocolates at the station here, 2 wrapping them up is here, and 3 casing is here. That should be up here. Okay, so we have 1 making the chocolates, 2 wrapping them up, and 3 casing the chocolates in the boxes. Now we can see that only a certain amount of people can fit into these little designated areas. So if we have like 7 units of people, they're fairly crowded, and even though they're able to make more chocolates, wrap them up more quickly, case them more quickly, we can see that they're crowded and that they can't work to their maximal efficiency. And this is This relates back to the concept of the diminishing marginal product of labour. And what this means is that as labour increases, the product per unit of labour decreases. So even though at the start we had one person, which was very ineffective, and as we increased that up to say 21 units, the labour productivity was maximized. But if we have more units than that, if we have say like 28 units of labour, there'll be 8 person at each station. And only 7 people can fit in this line. So one person will just be waiting. So the 8th person will just be waiting out at the back, doing nothing. And this represents diminishing marginal products. So even though we can say make 72 chocolates per hour now, the product per labour, 72 over 8, would equal only 9 units, or 9 chocolates per labour. Where here we have 70 divided by 10, and we have 70 divided by 7, we have 10 units of chocolate per labour. So let's examine how this would affect the, let's see how efficiency would affect the overall production of chocolates. So before we assume that every person could make 7 chocolates, or wrap 7 chocolates up in an hour. But now let's assume that this actually increases to 10. So we have 10 people. This is a completely new example. We have 10 people. They don't case, they make, they wrap, and they case. What happens is that if there are 10 people now, and they can make 10 chocolates per hour, then they would make 10, wrap 10, case 10. And that would be 10 times 10, which would equal 100, times 10, which is 100. So they would be able to make, wrap, and case 100 chocolates every hour. And this is greater than only the 70 that was made before. And now, as you can see, the supply has actually increased without changes in any labour resource. And the same goes for capital efficiency. If there are so many people in the labour force, then because the conditions in the labour force, in the labour market, not in the labour market, sorry, but in the firm's labour distribution, then the capital efficiency would also decrease because everybody would try to get to that machine, or everyone would try to use that machine, and it becomes less efficient as the working conditions get more crowded. Okay, so let's look at the example of how this affects the supply and demand curve. So let's take the same example of a chocolate market. So we have a chocolate market. Chocolate market. Just bear with me for a second. Okay, so we have a chocolate market. We have price along the y-axis, and we have quantity along the x-axis. Initially, we have an upward sloping supply and a downward sloping demand for simplicity. We're not going to assume any elasticity for the moment. And then we also have a price equilibrium at P and a quantity equilibrium at QE. Okay. What happens if labour or capital efficiency? So the labour is better utilizing the capital, or the labour efficiency itself has actually increased. Okay, so that represents a shift to the right of the supply curve. So it's a pretty shoddy line. There we go. So S1 to S2. And what this means is that initially, because producers are producing more, there would be a surplus in production at Q1, product Q2. So here, the supply is at S2, while the demand is still at QE. And this represents a surplus in supply. And to get rid of that surplus, producers will start lowering their price. So this represents another contraction in supply, because as they lower their price, becomes less profitable to sell, and therefore they will decrease the quantity sold. And concurrently, when the producers lower their price, or demanders or consumers would actually increase their demand. And that represents an expansion in demand. And so a new equilibrium point is reached. Let's call that PE dash and QE dash. And at this new point, everyone's happy once again. As you can see, because supply is becoming more efficient, or the labor capital is becoming more efficient, the prices in fact decrease, but the quantity supplied has increased. And as we can use this analysis for the converse as well, we can assume that if efficiency goes down, that means the labor or the capital utilization of that firm has decreased. This would represent a shift to the left of the supply curve. And as we can see, using the same supply demand analysis, QP supply demand, we can see if there's a shift of the supply to the left from S1 to S2, producers will experience an initial, so we have the equilibrium quantity here, so we have Q1, Q2. Initially, the producers will experience a shortage in supply because since they're producing less, because they're less efficient in producing, they have a shortage in supply. They would therefore increase prices so as to maintain profit margins, as well as see how much they can mark up their price so that their stocks could still be sold. And when they increase their price, demand will contract. So as we talked about before, this is an contraction in demand, and this is also an expansion in supply. And once again, a new equilibrium point is reached at Q3, and so that in fact should be P's. So that should be a P1, and that should be a P3. And so we reach a new equilibrium point at P3 and Q3. So as we can see, if efficiency goes down, the price would actually increase, and there would be a lower quantity relative to Q1 supplied. And this means that the overall materiality standards of the community would decrease. So to recap, increase in any efficiency would actually shift the supply curve to the right. And this will result in a lower price, equilibrium price, and a higher equilibrium quantity. So if there is an increase in efficiency, the result will be a supply curve shift to the right, equilibrium would decrease, quantity equilibrium would increase. If there is a decrease in efficiency, then we can see that the supply curve will shift to the left, and the equilibrium quantity, or the equilibrium price, would increase, and the equilibrium quantity traded would decrease. Okay, so that ends our lecture on micro supply factors and on labor and capital efficiency.